Welcome to Sticks, Carrots, and Tambourines, How Government Can Encourage Energy-Efficient Buildings. My name is Pulido. I'm the Sector Lead for New Builds and Planning at NABERS, and I'll be your facilitator for this session. You've got some great speakers for today. You'll have Natasha Palich, the Executive Officer for the Council Alliance for a Sustainable Built Environment, also known as CASBE. And Natasha's been practicing and promoting sustainability in architecture since the mid-1990s. Natasha is also an advocate for sustainable design in the local government sector. And you'll also hear from Kate Hopkins, the Senior Project Officer for the Office of Energy and Climate Change in New South Wales. And so Kate's responsible for the delivery of net zero emissions and climate change initiatives for New South Wales government. And Kate's also influencing land use planning policy and regulation to improve sustainability and resilience outcomes for new builds and precincts. So you're going to hear about a few things today. You're going to hear about how government, the journey, role, and learnings of government in achieving energy efficiency in buildings. You're also going to hear how government and councils are bringing about change in the planning system through advocacy and collaboration. And you're also going to understand how disclosure benchmarks can ensure carrot incentives rather than sticks. And then you'll have presentations from our speakers, so Natasha and Kate, and then we'll have a Q&A session, and that'll be your opportunity to ask questions and open up a conversation with our presenters. Throughout the session, feel free to type and shoot your questions through, and we'll bring those up during the panel discussion. We'll have 15 minutes to get through as many questions as we can. And then after the Q&A, we'll finish up the session and speak about what else is going on in NABERS and what will be useful for you to use in your various involvements in government. And those are things such as case studies, training, informational commitment agreements, for example. And just a reminder, so you can download the slides in the resource library, or I think there's a button at the top that you can click to download those as well, in case you wanted to follow at home. So I want you to think about these following questions I'm about to ask. I want you to think about, why do we need energy efficient buildings? And why are energy efficient buildings so important? And what is your role in delivering this? Australia has a goal to shift to net zero emissions by 2050. And each jurisdiction themselves has interim targets to go ahead and reduce their carbon emissions by a certain amount. All levels of government have a responsibility, and these are local, state, federal, to have an involvement in this shift as well. And so that brings us to the subject of energy efficient buildings. So we know that the building sector is responsible for about a fifth of the emissions in Australia of greenhouse gases. And we know that with good building design, we can have a significant impact on reducing these emissions and also benefit from things such as long-term cost and energy savings, higher asset prices, higher occupancies, for example. So we know that energy efficient buildings are critical for Australia's pathway to net zero. But did you know that not all buildings in Australia are achieving their energy efficiency targets? And what exactly does that mean? Well, this is bringing about this performance gap, this gap between the design and operation of a building once it's actually being constructed. And so what happens is that these developments end up using 25% more than they are expected to use once they are in operation, with some studies actually having much greater estimates. And this, of course, then leads to, not only is the performance gap uneconomical, because you've got increased costs associated with the operations, for example, but that it means we're generating more emissions than we actually intended. So we actually need to significantly reduce this performance gap in buildings from design to operation. And so councils and government play a pivotal role in setting, assessing, and enforcing energy efficiency and sustainability measures. So the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources commissioned a research project and survey in 2020 to gain some insights into the way local governments use planning sustainability tools, the NCC, which is the National Construction Code, and environmentally sustainable design to influence the energy efficiency of new commercial buildings. And so of that survey, about 245 councils were interviewed. That's about 46% of all the councils at the time, and it consisted of metro, regional, local councils. And the survey found that 70% had no additional controls or policies to the NCC. 58% had no additional voluntary measures to the NCC. And that 64% did not actually require energy efficiency measures above and beyond the NCC 2019. And there were reasons such as, it wasn't a council priority, they had a lack of council resources, and they relied on the minimum requirements set by the state and federal government. And so I'm saying this, but what does it exactly mean? Well, we know that many councils are struggling to know if their emissions goals are being met without sustainability tools, such as NABERS commitment agreements, NABERS ratings, but it shows that we aren't going above and beyond the minimum requirements. And it leads us to this final question I'll ask you before I pass you over to our speakers. Why do we have to achieve? Why do we have to achieve better than the minimum energy requirements? And simply put, it's because the minimum isn't enough. So the minimum isn't enough to get us to net zero by 2050. It isn't enough for jurisdictions to hit some of the targets they're wanting to hit by the times that they're shooting. So we need to achieve for the better than minimum energy efficiency requirements. And so with that, I'll pass you over to Natasha. Natasha, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I want to start by giving you an introduction to sustainability, a bit of history to sustainability and the Victorian planning system. So I represent a group of councils that have been working together for many years. That collaboration started back in the early 2000s with some ESD research in planning. Working together, councils developed sustainability assessment tools for buildings. These first emerged in 2004. The collaboration evolved over time and was formalised in 2009 with the creation of CASBE, supported by the Municipal Association of Victoria. And then things rolled on from there. And so in 2015, we had two significant milestones. We had the launch of a new at the time and improved tool called BESS online, and also the first of our local ESD policies were gazetted. Now, if we fast forward to now, we now have 22 actually, as of a couple of days ago, identical ESD local planning policies across Victoria. And next slide, does CASBE in 2022, we have 40 member councils, and that represents about 81% of the Victorian population. There's about 79 councils in Victoria, but our membership base does cover the most populated areas, and it covers about 77% of our state planning activity. Next slide, thanks. So our key projects, I'd like to get to the Elevating ESD Targets project. That's, I think, the most exciting to talk about at the moment, but I need to give you a bit of background. I'll start at the bottom. We have a project called the Sustainable Subdivisions Framework, which looks at trying to introduce comprehensive sustainability requirements for the subdivision stage of community planning. In planning in Victoria, individual dwellings often don't need a planning permit. So we're looking to influence the landscape within which those dwellings go. That's a project that's currently in trial at the moment. But the Elevating ESD Targets project is an expansion of our work that we've been doing for 2 decades now. And we call that work the SDAP framework. Stands for Sustainable Design Assessment in the Planning Process, bit of a mouthful. And it is about asking for, receiving and assessing information, sustainability information about projects as they come through the planning system. Next slide, thanks. So SDAP, it's, as I said, it's a streamlined and consistent methodology for having a conversation with developers about sustainability aspects of their development. And the goal is to support a industry-wide shift towards more sustainable outcomes. Next slide, thanks. So the components of the SDAP framework are the local ESD planning policy, best practice standards, and what we call the SDAP assets. So those include our sustainable design fact sheets, the Built Environment Sustainability Scorecard, which is known as BESS, and our SDAP resource kit, which is an internal set of documents to support councils in rolling out the SDAP framework. Next slide, thanks. So the ESD policy, first introduced in 2015 after many years' work, The reason we introduced this was because that there wasn't enough in the state planning framework at the time to enable a detailed sustainability assessment of buildings. So what it did, it covers off on a range of sustainability considerations, including energy, and it delivers outcomes above the minimum national construction code requirements in many environmental areas. But in energy, it actually goes beyond thermal performance outcomes of the envelope, and of course it goes beyond energy as well. Next slide, thanks. The best practice standards developed by councils are a series of design approaches that are reasonably considered to achieve the objectives in each of the environmental categories of the policy. So they're listed in the Sustainable Design Fact Sheets. They're also listed in BESS. Next slide, please. Built Environment Sustainability Scorecard, an online sustainability assessment tool purpose-built for Victorian councils, by Victorian councils for the SDAP framework, and it can assess any building type. It covers the elements that form good livability and design practice, but what it does is it actually draws those best practice standards into a digital format so that when a developer or an applicant is putting a building through the BESS tool, they can select the most appropriate design strategies for their project to meet a target in each environmental category. That's how BESS works. Next slide, thanks. You can see there that since we launched BESS in 2015, this is a graph showing quarter by quarter number of projects reported in BESS. But by mid last year, we were getting almost 1,300 new projects into the BESS tool every quarter. Next slide, thanks. So just what does that mean in terms of numbers? So in 2020 to 2021, BESS assessed 56 million square metres of buildings, 33,100 dwellings, and 3.4 million square metres of non-residential buildings. Next slide, thanks. We're getting some really interesting data out of the BESS tool, and what it's suggesting is that over 80% of apartment buildings that were assessed in the BESS tool between 2019 and 2021 would have met the draft 2022 National Construction Code standards, being a 7-star average energy rating for the envelope. So they've chosen that on a pathway to achieving a energy performance target. So they've chosen the improved envelope design strategy as their preferred way of getting to that energy performance target. So to our Elevating ESD Targets Planning project. So what this is, councils have, over the last couple of years, CASBE member councils have resolved to elevate the targets that are in the current local ESD policy. Remember, that was first gazetted in 2015, but it was written back in 2019. And it's seen that within the context of climate emergency, we need stronger targets, including a pathway to zero carbon buildings. So we've been working on it for a couple of years, but councils came together formally at the start of last year to progress this particular project and embarked on an evidence gaining research project, I suppose, to inform a joint council planning scheme amendment. So that's next slide. We should be on a slide that outlines the problem, the solution, and Elevating ESD Targets project. That's what I just talked about. Next slide after that is stage 1, talks about stage 1. Our independent review of the draft ESD planning policy and objectives was undertaken by 3 consultants, one that looked at the technical feasibility of it, one that looked at the planning context, and one that did an economic benefit cost analysis. And next slide, thanks. Those reports have now been reviewed by the member councils. There were 31 councils involved in stage 1, and we're now on the cusp between stage 1 and stage 2 of this project, which is quite exciting because what we're now working with councils to do is to bring councils together to actually undertake a planning scheme amendment. The findings from the planning consultant was that the policy instruments, the planning policy instruments that are normally available to councils weren't going to deliver the outcomes that the project was seeking. And so the advice from the planning consultant was that councils seek a state planning policy instrument to implement these changes. So at the moment, we are gathering councils together, and the goal is to submit an amendment, and it will be seeking a state particular provision. So that's a state policy instrument, which will have these ESD, detailed ESD objectives and standards within them. At the moment, as of last night, we have 15 councils that are committed to progress to stage 2, and we've got another, I think, dozen councils that have meetings scheduled in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So you can see there on the next slide, thanks, operational energy objectives. You can see some of the objectives that are in that draft particular provision. Next slide, thanks, embodied carbon. We're also looking at encouraging development that considers the life cycle impact of resources. Next slide, thanks. This is my last slide, talking about sticks, carrots and tambourines. So from our experience of 20 years working in this area, what would we say about that? Well, the stick is that planning policy, clear standards, making developers have that conversation is instrumental, I think, in getting a broad-scale shift within industry towards more sustainable outcomes. You can use some carrots, though, alongside that stick. So sustainability assessment tools like NABERS, like BEST, but like NABERS, helps quicker and more consistent ESD assessment across councils. And the side benefit of that is that having better environmental and sustainability outcomes delivers better planning outcomes overall. Planning is about amenity. Sustainability produces amenity. And so tambourines, we need to, I think, celebrate the opportunity that local government presents to the design and building sector, because the collaboration that we've had has shown that local government can have a really strong voice and contribute meaningfully to this debate. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Natasha. And I can really see some parallels drawn between the progress of the BEST tool and the progress of the NABERS tool. One that caught my eye was the increasing use. You had a graph that had an increasing use of numbers, and very similar where NABERS has an increased amount of ratings year on year, but also that you have an increasing amount of floor space with the BEST tool, similar with NABERS, something we're looking at, and we're also moving into, we get more ratings, more floor space, more building types, and we're also expanding into other sectors as well. Most recently, we announced that we're expanding to supermarkets, retail, and schools. And then we've just recently, as of in the past 12 months, I believe, it was a residential aged care and retirement living, and then cold storages and warehouses. So it's great to see that numerous sustainability tools. It's not just NABERS, it's BEST. There's other tools as well that are continuing to grow as the market grows, and that there's a demand for the tools and a demand for the tools in other sectors and building types. So what I'll do now is I'll pass you over to Kate for her presentation.
Thank you very much, Ron. And hello, everybody. My name is Kate Hopkins. I am a Senior Project Officer with the New South Wales Office of Energy and Climate Change. We're actually a newly established office, as I'm sure has been made mention of earlier in the conference. We work within New South Wales Treasury now, but we used to work within the Department of Planning and Environment and have established quite a few connections there. We work quite closely in my team with our colleagues in Department of Planning, as well as with the New South Wales Government Architect and also, of course, NABERS. And I'm here today to talk, you'll hear from me really around our work in the commercial building sector, but we also work in other building types and across other scales, so precincts as well. And we're looking at ESD outcomes across the whole planning system. But the work today that I'm going to be talking about is about energy efficiency and transition of commercial buildings to net zero. And as we all know, the building sector plays such a critical role in getting our whole economy to net zero. We have about 10 to 15 years as the grid decarbonises for buildings to transition away from fossil fuel energy and to decarbonise. So essentially to be able to take up that opportunity to use renewable energy from the grid. And energy efficiency remains a really cost-effective tool or a technology in comparison to other technologies. So it really is the sector that needs to lead first. And the opportunity is in new buildings as well and new major developments. So we have this opportunity now to really make sure that our buildings are performing to the standard that they need to be performing to. But we know, as Ron alluded to before, that there is a performance gap that exists between what is designed and what is built. And that's a systemic issue, and that's an issue that we're trying to address in the work that I'm going to talk about now. We also really don't have a very good understanding of the nuanced energy performance of buildings across Australia. And so there's an opportunity for us to, through the planning process and development process, to capture information about the designed and as-built performance of buildings, so that we can use that information to feed into future policy processes. So as Natasha was saying before, it's about joining up that local government consent process and that the design work, and also being able to have a look at that at a whole of system level. And as a state, we have the opportunity to do that. So we're also operating as a state from quite a strong policy base. We have the New South Wales Net Zero Plan, which has a net zero emissions target by 2050, but also an interim target of 50% emissions reduction by 2030 compared to 2005 levels. And in conjunction with that, we have the electricity infrastructure roadmap, and that roadmap is really our ability to transition our whole electricity grid to renewables as quickly and rapidly as possible. So those two things working in partnership together are critical to this piece. And in terms of, we were talking before about sticks, carrots, tambourines. The tambourines and the carrots are really, things like NABERS, Green Star, all of the thought leadership that it's occurring across the whole, everyone I think out there that's listening in today, everyone plays a part in this whole system. And we're really fortunate at New South Wales to be able to collaborate with our colleagues, with DISA, with NABERS in other jurisdictions, and hopefully, see if we can start to resolve these issues around performance gaps and compliance with the National Construction Code. Speaking of the National Construction Code, we know that will be updated in 2019 with new NABERS commitment agreement pathways, which is very exciting for hotels and retail, as well as what's already existing for offices. And those pathways have been calculated to be in alignment with deemed to satisfy methods. And so we know that those NABERS ratings that are going to be specified in the 2019 policy will actually be the energy performance ratings that buildings will need to comply with. So that actually gives us an opportunity to look at, okay, well, if a performance of a building should be deemed to satisfy synonymous with a NABERS rating, what does that mean? And can we actually have a look at if a building is complying once it's actually in operation, and look at mechanisms to drive the performance of buildings that way. So in New South Wales, we have a complex but also quite nimble planning system. And I won't go into it in any detail, but you can see up on the screen that there's a hierarchy of planning instruments. At the local level, we have local environmental plans that are the statutory thing that govern how zoning is done and whatnot. But at the state level, we have this opportunity to do these state environmental planning policies, or SEPs. As an example of a SEP is the basic SEP, which some of you may be familiar with, which governs how residential buildings are designed. And so we have an opportunity here for commercial buildings to also develop a SEP. And that's something that we're actively exploring at the moment. And that SEP would be working on establishing the standards that New South Wales commercial buildings need to follow, but also looking at updating the EP&A regulation and the application requirements. So I think what Natasha said before about having a system whereby information can be collected and updated over time, and it can be done in a digital form, is so powerful, because it means that we can collect data that we don't have right now and really get a really thorough understanding about how our buildings are performing, and set those benchmarks and get that uplift over time, because that has, as we all know, has been an issue in policy making for a while. So through our work, we are, as I mentioned, trying to address this performance gap. There's been some research commissioned by DISA looking at international literature, an international literature review, and that was conducted as part of this energy efficiency task group. And they came up with some key recommendations, and they include the greater transparency of operational performance of buildings and outcome-based policies that regulate operational performance. And this really resonates with me. These two recommendations are things that we take into every day that we do our work. Combined with that, we know that NABERS rated buildings actually do improve their performance over time. And so we know that as buildings are rated, and there's that feedback loop with the building engineers, the maintenance, the asset managers around how to actually uplift their performance over time, it does start to happen. So what does this all mean for us in terms of our work? So what we're trying to do here is really support buildings to get to net zero ready as quickly as possible. Net zero ready means a building that is capable of running off 100% renewable energy from day one of its operation. So for large commercial buildings, we do expect that those buildings are built to that standard now. And while we're not looking to necessarily require that the buildings are going to be able to do that straight away, we are looking at incentives or disincentives. So for example, if a building isn't built to accept 100% renewable energy, then is there a way that we can require offsets, for example, for the fossil fuel that is used? So there are things that we are actively exploring at the moment, and really interested in hearing any other jurisdictions that might be doing similar things as well. So if you're doing similar work, please do get in touch. So if those buildings are operating on fossil fuel energy, then we want to know that they're also putting forward the space in the electrical infrastructure to be able to transition away from that energy by 2035. Because by that stage, we want to see all buildings, or as many buildings as possible, being able to operate from renewable energy, either electricity from the grid or on-site energy or renewable gas. So it's really critical that we have that that infrastructure or infrastructure readiness in place with these building types as well. And the other thing that we're looking at doing, obviously, is as we build our system, we have an opportunity to capture data at development application and construction certificate. So at the moment, private certification schemes or certifiers don't need to disclose Section J reports. It's all kind of fragmented and not really all brought into one cohesive space. We're looking at using our e-planning system in New South Wales to collate all of that information about how buildings are designed. So let us know what your what the verification pathway of Section J you're going to be using. Is it deemed to satisfy? Give us information about what you're doing so that we can build a better understanding of how your building will operate, or that you're complying. And then once the building has been built and it's being occupied, then within 18 months of that occupation certificate to actually get an energy rating from NABERS or Green Star or an equivalent rating. And those buildings then will have that greater transparency of information that, that we really need to address that performance gap. Which brings me to my final slide, which is really about what we're trying to do here is build a system of continuous improvement. So when we create a SEP, we have an opportunity to make sure that that SEP can be revised every few years. And we can do that in alignment with revisions to the National Construction Code, in alignment with the National Trajectory for Low Energy Buildings, and make sure that what we're doing is really fit for purpose and is driving the outcomes that we want to be seeing. So there's, through that opportunity to collect information at various points of the development cycle, we believe that we'll have that sufficient data that we can use to build that policy setting over time. And potentially, we may start with large commercial buildings, but we may phase in to new buildings, to other building types, and scale to other building types over time. And just in summary, so the theme of this session is sticks, carrots and tambourines. I've talked a lot about, I guess, the stick that we can use, the regulations that we can use through the planning system. This is a soft touch kind of a regulation, but there are other things that we are exploring to sort of strengthen the work that we do. We're interested in working, obviously, with DISA and our federal colleagues on how we can continue to improve that compliance with the code. And we're also exploring other options in other themes of sustainability as well. From a carrots perspective, at the moment in New South Wales, there are a range of programs under the Net Zero Plan which are supporting buildings to transition away from fossil fuel energy. There's a few that are being run by NABERS. There's obviously the Energy Savings Scheme, or Security Safeguard, I should say. And so we have those mechanisms. We're also looking at how do we extend existing programs to new builds as well. So there's a few things that we're looking at and exploring here. And from a tambourines perspective, as I said earlier, I think the work that you all do in this sector is phenomenal, and I'm really looking forward to engaging with everybody as we continue to develop this system. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. And I think all the work you spoke about really is a testament to how state government can lead, in this net zero journey and this drive for energy efficient buildings. And I think it's also something other jurisdictions can look at to say, look, this is the work New South Wales is doing and leading on. At some point throughout the journey, or maybe part of the conversation, if you're not a part of it already, is something you could be involved in as well. And we've heard, from the voice of a collection of councils, they'll bring about a change in the state planning system and how high ESD outcomes deliver, better planning outcomes. And we've also heard how, state government is working with a wide number of stakeholder groups to ensure that the buildings we build today can get to net zero as soon as possible. And it's a nice segue into this Q&A discussion session now. So I'm going to go ahead and look at the questions that we've got from the audience. So if you haven't done it yet or haven't pushed it through, go ahead and do so. And we'll do the first question now. So it's a question for everybody. How have developers reacted to the proposed changes in Victoria and New South Wales? And how have you ensured that they are a part of the conversation? So we might start with Natasha, and then we'll let Kate answer that question. So off to you, Natasha.
Thank you, Ron. So the process of asking for and receiving and assessing sustainability information started many, many years ago. And so over many years of councils introducing trials into their municipality and then seeking direct feedback from their local development communities and then feeding that feedback back to CASBE, and we've adjusted the system and then put it back out again. We've the STAT framework has grown and emerged, literally over 2 decades of that process, to the point now where it is largely an off-the-shelf system that a council can adopt, knowing that it is applied now in 29 council areas across Victoria. And so there is a general now understanding of what is involved. The end goal being, of course, that developers don't get a different set of requirements when they cross a municipal boundary. So that's the STAT framework. With the Sustainable Subdivisions framework, that was something, and just as by way of example of how we've engaged with developers, when we developed that framework, we sought input from the development industry, and now that we're running it through a trial, we have a technical reference panel which is informing and guiding the trial and its outputs, and they're from a range of sectors across the industry. And we have had that in the past for aspects of the STAT framework, and we're implementing it now to take a technical reference panel that is across the entire framework to provide guidance on that. They're just a snapshot of some of the ways that we've engaged with the development industry.
And so from a state government perspective in New South Wales, so we've been engaging and consulting with a whole range of stakeholders for about 18 months now on this work. And so we've had a few consultation sessions with, for example, with the Property Council to really tease out, whether or not these standards are going to be fit for purpose. I think one of the key things about our work is that we want to make sure that we are harmonising with the National Construction Code. So we're not necessarily requiring standards that go above and beyond, but at the same time shifting the dial just a little bit in terms of requiring that buildings are doing these slightly additional things. So buildings can still be constructed in to the same standard as before, and so that there won't be any additional capex that the state government is asking for there. So we think, you know, from a cost perspective that things are. Yeah, so from a development perspective, really it's about ensuring that we're addressing those concerns about cost, but also making sure that consent authorities and proponents are able to, you know, this isn't going to be an administrative burden. So yeah, the way that developers have responded so far is really positively to this work, and you know, it's BAU what we're talking about for some of the larger property developers and tier 1 developers. This is really business as usual, is what we're hearing, and that, you know, there's a real desire for this to happen.
So it does sound like it is rather positive, and they are in fact already a part of the conversation. And I really think it's one of those things where you know, you can't really achieve this level of change and, you know, the journey that's being taken without speaking to the right people, without including them as part of the process, and it would probably be unwise to do so as well. All right. So we move to the next question. So it's another question for everyone. One of the challenges mentioned was that lots of councils don't have enough funding, or there's not enough people to do the work, which is why sustainability in the planning states can often fall by the wayside. What would you say to either a state or local government? How do we overcome these obstacles that won't go away overnight? So probably do the reverse of the answers, and maybe start with you this time, Kate.
Sure. Yeah, so I think the challenges for local government are always resourcing. You know, there's a huge amount of work with very few human resources or you know, capital or OPEX. I would say, you know, continuing to work together with the state, and you know, by collaborating together, we can actually create more collective power and collective impact. I think the role of joint organisations of councils, or like the role of CASBE, for example, it's very powerful in terms of being able to assemble you know, all of these voices in one place, and being able to create, you know, advocacy positions or create business cases, for example, that that can fund this work. So I actually feel like we're getting some traction here. 2 years ago, our program didn't exist, but, you know, we sort of saw this opportunity through collaboration, through relationship building that we had done with neighbours, to really explore how can we build this system. So as soon as that problem gets identified, it's just about sort of increasing that visibility of the problem, increasing that awareness, and then working together to come to a common solution.
Thanks, Kate. And how about you, Natasha?
Look, it's a very real issue, and it's a top of mind for us all the time. And so by creating CASBE, you're basically trying to address that issue. So you create one set of resources that everyone feeds into, that everyone can then use, and you don't have councils creating the resources individually. That being said, there's still, you know, often not enough time or capacity in the council staff to run these programs, and that's, I guess, why we've seen a slow uptake over the years. Not a slow, but you know, CASBE is an opt-in process, and so when councils feel that they have the resources to join, which isn't an ideal outcome, because what it means is that the less resourced councils may not ever feel that they've got the capacity to join in. We're trying to address that at the moment. Some of the things that we're doing are organising councils together to apply for funding for dedicated shared people resources, and we've been recently successful in getting a couple of those positions up and running, and they will then share their expertise across a range of different councils, loosely based in regional areas. So that's something we've been able to do. And you know, the other thing is that we've done internally is that we've provided mentoring programs for council officers that are wishing to sidestep into dedicated ESD roles. We provide internal training. It's a range of things we do, but you're quite right in identifying that as a very key issue.
Thanks, and I think I might chime in on that as well. From a DISER-funded project that NABERS is running right now with various councils across various states across Australia, while interviewing many councils, and there are normally very unique problems even within the same state, where it could be unique or common across them, and then you have your unique planning systems across different states. But it was a very common challenge where, as it would be everywhere, that they did say that they've got a lack of resourcing, or it's too hard to create things from scratch. And I think one of the key things is that they also mentioned, it's not that we don't want to do it, it's that if we had the answer, we could do it. So as part of this project, we are creating and developing and working with the councils to create capacity building initiatives. We'll talk about that a bit later on, but it really answers that if there are things that could be supported by working together, so that you can leverage the resources of everyone else, you don't have to work in silos, you can put together your work to create a consensus on the way to go forward, such as what CASBE is doing with the Elevating ESD project, that would be an ideal scenario. But I won't talk too much longer on that. We probably have time for only one more question, and then we'll wrap up the session. So I'll ask this now, and this one is, it's a question specifically for Kate. So the New South Wales Design and Place step was recently scrapped. What is happening with that now?
That's a great question. So when I mentioned before that our work went on public exhibition, it did go on exhibition as part of the Design and Place SEP package, which was a big design reform, which was proposing to integrate various planning instruments into one. So it was going to be the one step to rule them all, and it was an exciting process to be part of. It did get pulled by the Minister for Planning earlier this year, as you rightly identified, but the work that I'm talking about in the commercial sector with non-residential buildings is continuing, but in a different form and in a different SEP. So that is the plan at the moment, but we're still exploring how that all kind of fits together and integrates. But yeah, there is definitely a real desire. As I mentioned before, I think industry is just ready for this, and it's imperative that we do develop these systems to enable buildings to get to net zero faster.
Thanks, Kate. And it's definitely an interesting thing to look at, something to monitor, and we'll be looking at how that progresses very closely. So that wraps up the questions. We do apologize that we weren't able to get to all of them, but I think one thing I'd like to mention is that this is an ongoing conversation, and if this is the first time you're watching us, thank you for joining. And the first time you might be engaging with either NABERS, the Office of Energy and Climate Change, or CASBE themselves, if it's the start of the conversation, feel free to reach out to us. It's something we're more than happy to speak about, and I'm sure that we could answer much more questions in much more detail. But it was good that we did get some very good questions and had some very detailed answers from Kate and Natasha. So we're very close to the end of the session now, and I did want to touch on what else is going on in NABERS, because there's a lot going on. We're a national program, and you're probably wondering, we mentioned things like commitment agreements, and we mentioned things like this council project we're working on. So we do have some materials available on the website, guides specifically to on how to use commitment agreements, what they are, how you could use them throughout the planning process, for example, from DA all the way, development application all the way to the construction process. And this capacity building project, I'll show you a few slides of what we're producing in the end. We've got more webinars and workshops that we'd like to do similar like this, to talk about the journeys of other councils, to work with other industry organizations, to have another chat about what's going on in the broader sense. And then we also have some offers available with new buildings and energy starters. So you'll find some information there on the website, and of course at the end of this session. So I want to show you a bit of what these capacity building initiatives are. So we've recently released some training within New South Wales and Victoria, of course unique to the planning systems in each of the states. And the idea is that it's for planning professionals, so you can understand a bit more in the context of the planning system how you can use sustainability tools, and what net zero targets mean, what setting energy efficiency targets mean, and how you can apply these for compliance within the NCC or specific development controls. Here's a snapshot of what those training modules look like. Of course, the idea is for it to be very unique to the system in each state. And then we're also releasing case studies to give you that readily available material that was asked for specifically by councils to say, okay, what are some of the journeys you're talking about that have been successful or maybe not so successful in using sustainability tools? What are these financial insights you're talking about? You're talking about 25%, you're talking about cost savings. So to give you very specific examples of where this has been used, taking place, the context of it. So perhaps if you are watching from a council yourself or you've been involved in this process, that may be something you can apply with that as well. And that is bringing us to the end of the session. I'd like to thank you so much, Kate and Natasha, once more for joining us for this panel discussion. Of course, thank you all for joining. Again, I'd like to say it's an ongoing conversation. Please reach out to any of us directly. We'll now be moving into a short break, and then you can join us again for the next deep dive sessions. But thank you once more.